Proud supporters of Africa this week. Engine, with us, you are number one.
Welcome back to Africa This Week. In this part of the program, we look at the public sector employment trends in South Africa and discuss the Sudanese oil crisis. South African public service employment is growing 4 times faster than original employment. Fears remain that the government is not filling positions required to improve service delivery and help boost economic growth. Lucy Holborn, a research manager at the South African Institute of Race Relations, explained.
Well, I think it's a question of where those jobs are being created. We know of the 1.3 million public service workers, about 450,000 are public sector nurses and teachers, another 200,000 are in the police service. But there's all those other bureaucrats behind the scenes, some of which are clearly essential, but some of which are a sort of another layer of bureaucracy that some people question whether people are getting value for money in that sense. So the increase in numbers doesn't necessarily directly correlate to improved service delivery.
Okay. Is it worrying that the state has become a major employer? Some would say that's a worrying trend.
I think so. If we look at trends in Europe, they're trying to scale back their public sector, and that creates huge problems in retrenching people, reducing the wage bill of the public service. We already know that public sector personnel expenditure accounts for a third of all government expenditure. So it's quite a high figure already. And Pravin Gordhan has said he wants to keep it at 5% growth over the next few years. But at the moment, in the last few years, it's been growing at 17%. So we need to look at those sorts of issues and look at whether this is really sustainable in terms of our fiscal policy.
So when the wage bill is growing at 17% because government is paying salaries, it raises the question of productive uses of taxpayers' money versus this recurrent expenditure. Government has committed itself to an infrastructure program, but we're told that there's huge bottlenecks in the tendering process, which is good. Better governance, make the process more democratic. But we're not seeing better use of the buck as taxpayers. What could the government do better?
Well, I think clearly it's about efficiency of the use of those funds. So part of that will be the skills of the people working in government at all levels of management. We just saw yesterday the Auditor General report looking at accounting skills. Those sort of financial management skills are really important to make sure taxpayers get value for money in terms of these frontline services. We know, for instance, in the government housing sector, huge amounts of money have been wasted either through fraud or just poor management. So it's those sorts of issues that can ensure that money is spent well and that the people we are employing in public sector are earning their wage, as it were.
Yeah. We've got a new growth path, and their government is hoping that overall the South African economy can absorb 5 million people into the economy. If the private sector is loath to employ because they're worried about their margins, it then leaves it to the government to create those labor-intensive areas that can absorb people into jobs. So public works programs, infrastructure build programs. So in the context of the government's priorities for job creation, are we going to see a lot more public service jobs then?
Well, it's been talked about in various departments. We hear the Department of Agriculture talking about rural employment schemes. We hear about infrastructure schemes, expanded public works programs, those sorts of things. So we can expect it to some extent, but I think we have to be very careful at assuming that the government can solve this problem themselves. 5 million jobs is 5 times as many public service employees as we already have. So clearly government can't be responsible for all of those jobs. And we have to look at how the government can play a role in allowing the private sector to create the jobs. That will be sort of labour market regulation, those sorts of issues, small business, encouraging small businesses. They'll be major employers in the future. And we've got to look at those sorts of things and look at the government's role as more an enabler for creating jobs rather than the body that creates jobs itself.
Sudan and South Sudan continue to trade accusations over oil revenues, the lifeline of both economies. The South accuses Khartoum of stealing oil on transit through the north, while Sudan says it was confiscating oil as compensation for what it says are unpaid fees for using its pipeline. Andrew Asamoah, senior researcher at the Institute of Security Studies, gave us a breakdown of the conflict.
It's a bit complicated if you look at it with the lens of legality. The reason being that the agreement that would have dictated the terms of the joint use of the infrastructure are still being discussed. And therefore, as at now, is actually the status quo that is persisting. And the context has changed a little bit, because if this had happened before the split, where both countries had a joint ownership of the infrastructure, the South could have argued that they have a bit of ownership of the infrastructure. At the moment, the infrastructure is to the North what the 75% of oil that has remained with the South is to the South. And therefore, there's a change of ownership of the infrastructure, and therefore, looking at it in the legalities is a bit more complicated.
This issue of fees was supposed to have been settled in June of last year, prior to South Sudan becoming independent. And experts had warned that oil is going to be make or break for this exercise in sovereignty and legitimacy for a new country. Why did all the mediators not resolve this thing with urgency?
Well, it's one of the key things that the world, including the African Union, actually foresaw, because very many analysts warned that, including a number of pending issues, oil was going to be an issue. And it's therefore one of the key reasons why the AU set up the high-level implementation panel led by the former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, to negotiate and facilitate dialogue on the process. It's just that it's been very slow, and all these negotiations are still ongoing. And one key thing is that it used to be one state, and the South was just a semi-autonomous region. It was easier dealing with them at that time. Now that the context has changed, you are dealing with two independent sovereign states. And therefore, the leverage with which you can negotiate and put pressure has diminished. You can actually appeal to them in terms of them using their sovereign rights to make decisions. And therefore, that is why some of these issues have been dragging on for some time. But it was foreseen even before the split, just that the negotiations have been very slow.
What's in dispute here? Because obviously, South Sudan, in becoming independent, takes up 75% of oil produced to the oil wells. North Sudan retains 25% and the pipeline to the ports in the north. The South needs that pipeline to get the oil into market and will pay some kind of a levy to do so. For me, that's pretty simple, but it's not.
It's not, because the two sides have not agreed in terms of what it is that both sides are supposed to pay. The South understands that, yes, they need to pay for the use of the infrastructure, and the North also understands that they need to charge something. But as to what they need to agree on per barrel is a contention. While the North is talking about between $32 and $36 per barrel, the South is actually negotiating for far less. They're actually going for less than $1 per barrel, looking at other cases elsewhere. And that is the bone of contention. The possession of the infrastructure, as you said, rightly mentioned, belongs to the North now. And therefore, the bargaining chip for the North has increased, given that the South hasn't got any other alternatives. It is now up to the South to try and look for other alternatives so as to reduce the bargaining chip and the potency of the stance of the North, so that they can argue for a reduction.
That's all for this edition of Africa This Week. Join us again next week for another roundup of the top stories in Africa. From me, Mashudu Masuta, and the team, it's goodbye.